So they just like put dog box over.
See,
We're gonna try this live stream. We'll see if it works.
All right.
yay, live.
It's super weird to see the delay on video and like audio. All right, folks, we're going to give everyone a couple more minutes before we join or before we get started. We have a packed schedule because I was not paying attention to how many people wanted to present, so I apologize. We have 2 presentations today. Brandon is going to be talking about Spiffy Tornjack, and Aradna and a few others are going to be talking about the white paper that they've been working on. If I could have somebody go ahead and volunteer as a scribe, that would be fantastic. Just a reminder, the meeting is being recorded and live streamed now and posted to YouTube immediately. Your participation in these meetings is an agreement to abide by our Cloud Native Security Code of Conduct, which can be found within the repository. And we will be skipping updates and triage today because of the amount of presentations that we have. Okay, I have posted the meeting notes in the chat. Please go ahead and add yourself. Like I said before, we won't be doing any updates or any triage today. And thank you, Pushkar, for scribing. Brandon, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. So today we're going to start with talking about Tonya, myself, and my colleague Marush. I'm going to give you a run through. So 1 second while I share my screen. Cool. Do you see my slide?
You're good to go.
All right. So hi, everyone. So Marish and I today going to share with you a bit about management of workload identities. This is a project that we started earlier this year. We recently successfully got through all the legal stuff and got it donated to CNCF under Spiffy. So for those curious and for those wondering why Andrews was talking about puppies just now, so the project name is Tonyak, and the name actually originates from a breed of sheep herding dog. So because in Cloud Native we always say, we treat workload as cattle, not pets. So we were like, maybe it's appropriate if we call this project, name this project after a sheep herding dog, because technically we are managing our cattle. Yeah, so introduction, I think most of the folks kind of know me from the calls. Brandon, I'm here with my colleague Mariusz as well. Mariusz Sabaf, we both work at IBM Research. And the picture I have over here is actually a picture of our building that we work at. So interesting thing about this building is a very modern looking office. However, this building was actually built in the 60s. It's the IBM TJ Watson Research Center. And also apparently it houses like a lot of dangerous chemicals that we work with side by side every day. Marius, do you want to give a quick introduction? Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I couldn't find the button. So yes, I'm a senior engineer, cloud engineer in Yorktown. I work together with Brendan, and our primary focus right now is identity in clouds. All right, that's it.
Awesome. So we're gonna start with like a bit of motivation, talk a little bit about workload identity. Some of it I think for folks may be familiar with. Why we started the Tonya project. We'll go through what the Tonya project is. We'll go through a couple of demos, and we will at the end talk a little bit about kind of like the bigger problem that we are trying to solve, and how how Tonya plays a part of that. And also this is kind of like a sneak peek into what we're going to be talking about at KubeCon. So when we talk about identity, the first thing that usually comes to mind is, for most folks, is user identity, right? Are you talking about emails, passwords, the headaches like password policies, auditing, making sure there's no zombie accounts and all that. But equally important in the cloud native ecosystem is workloads, right? So every microservice, every pod has an identity. And today we're seeing that workloads are kind of doing very similar things to users as well, right? They're accessing services and data and so on. So in cloud native, as we mentioned before, workloads are treated as cattle, not pets. So gone are the days that it's practical to manually keep track of all the workloads in the spreadsheet and be able to manage the identities manually. Workloads are now, they're plentiful. There's so many of them. They're ephemeral. They come and go not only within the infrastructure, but also in development. Microservices spin up and down very agilely. And they run in all different environments and come in all shapes and sizes. So we start to see that properties of the workload start to resemble users, right? There's a lot of them, they change a lot, we need some structure around them. And in fact, both user identities and workloads are pretty much used for very similar use cases today, right? Authenticating, accessing data and services. And one may even say in certain environments, workloads from a security and compliance perspective handle equally or more sensitive data than users. So the big question that we're asking is, there's so much tooling, there's like 101 different tools around user management for user identities. Why don't we kind of have the same treatment of workload identities, given that they are they're becoming equally important as well. So enter Spiffy Spire. This is kind of like the basis of the Tonya project. We're building on top of an identity framework. For those that may not be familiar, Spiffy, the secure production identity framework for everyone, is a specification of a secure workload identity framework for cloud native workloads. And Spire is an implementation of the specification. So through the use of Spiffy and Spire, users are given tools to be able to register workloads. They can attest the workloads and the underlying platforms that they're on, and they can issue and securely deliver authentication materials like X509 certificates or JWT tokens. A couple of folks on this call, as well as others, we wrote a nice book called Solving the Bottom Turtle. It's the Spiffy Spire book. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, I think I'll drop the link later in the chat, or someone can drop it there. So with that in mind, right, where does Tonya come in? So today Spire has some challenges. Kind of talking about the management problem that we mentioned earlier. So Spire is a very, very powerful tool. However, when it comes to administration today, most of it is done via CLI. So First, this can fall short when dealing with structured data. For example, when you visualize the spire topology, or we want to try and sift through or filter through massive amounts of data. One of the other motivations for having a management plane is that there often is a requirement to keep some inventory on metadata or spire agents and entries and how they correspond to the organization or different platforms. So one example in this is, and we'll kind of show a demo of this later, is that when you have a spire deployment, when you have an agent, there's no way to kind of figure out whether that agent is running on a Kubernetes node, a Unix node, or it's running a Docker daemon. So some additional metadata today is kept separately. So it's not just going to be, so Tonya isn't just really a kind of UI, a nice looking interface for Aspire, but the goal is to be able to solve some of the enterprise problems as well around workload identity. So in enterprise, there are certain features that are required for security and management compliance. So these are things like global visibility, being able to see, which what the identity is being created, who owns them, how they're being used, auditability, of course, and policy management. And the reason why this is difficult in Spire is because Spire allows the ability to extend to many different infrastructure services, and that is part of the design, that you can use it with different upstream services, you can use it with different databases, with different key measures. And the idea here is that the task of kind of aggregating, collecting all this information and putting it in a central area that is queryable is non-trivial. And so this is another aspect of Tonya that we're trying to achieve here. And last but not least, CISOs, auditors, non-Spire power users need to be able to query, audit identity information for workloads, but they don't necessarily need to be Spire power users. So this is something that we want to address with Tonya as well. Right, I'm just gonna look through chat just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Cool. So in short, Tonya aims to provide a control plane for Spire, provide global visibility, auditability, policy configuration management for workload identities. So I mentioned this before. So this is started early this year, recently donated. But more importantly, let's get to looking at a demo. So at this point, any questions while I switch to the demo?
So Andres has a question. As you've alluded, Spire doesn't keep state of things. Is it a goal of Tonya to provide observable attestations or keep a record of?
So that is one of the parts of auditability that we're trying to do. So more specifically, I think we're trying to be able to link the attestation information. So we're trying to figure out, the logs from the agents, the logs from the Spire servers. What are people's model of using it? Do they all push it into a general log store? And the idea is that, we would be able to click on the identity, be able to query all the attestation information and have that be kind of feedback. I'm not sure whether there is also an aspect of evidence, Andrew, that you're asking. So for things like TPM, hardware attestation, and things like that, there is going to be a separate set of logs, which will provide, like, here are the signed attestations. I think we are working with Keylime on this right now. There seems to be some details that have not been pinned down as to how the evidence would look like and how to validate it yet. But I think the idea is once those things get developed and become more concrete, we would want to also include it in the attestation log.
So Brandon, this is Radna. I'm trying to understand deployment. How will this be deployed on a container platform and where?
Awesome. So that's what I'm gonna share.
Okay. No,
So
I
I'm
mean,
gonna
at a higher level, do you have a pictorial view that tells us rather than
Yes.
getting into the code?
Yes. So I'm gonna show a very simple deployment first, and then in my slides I'll show a slightly more complex
Okay.
deployment.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So when I get to the slide, I'll look back to the question.
Cognac as a service.
Yeah, so we have kind of set up this Kubernetes Quick Set. So for those that are not familiar with Spire, this is kind of like the Spire 101 tutorial on a Kubernetes cluster, right? So single cluster, single node on Minikube, we deploy everything there. And the idea we want to show here is that Tonya really, if we take the quick start, what we're doing is we're just changing the image here, right? We're changing it to the Tonya image. So the way that we see this, at least for people that want to try it out, they can just replace the Spire image with the Tonya Spire image, and it should work out of the box. So we have one that's running here. And so if you look at, for example, so this is the one that we just created. If we go to Tonya server info, we can kind of see the different information, what the different plugins being used with this Tonya server. We can go to agents to kind of take a look at the different agents. We can also look at the entries, right? This is one that I just created. And what I was talking about adding metadata, for example, when you create entries today, right, in Spire, what you have to do is you have to kind of create this command line that looks something like that, right? You're like, okay, create a new entry, you have to specify the Spiffy ID, the different selectors, and so on. So we want to make it a little bit easier. So one of the things that we're doing is we have a entry creation form. So what I can do is I have this agent here, and I want to add some metadata to it. So for example, I'm going to say this is a Kubernetes agent because I know it's running on Minikube. I'm going to click Save and Add. So now this agent is associated with Kubernetes. And then what I can do is then when I create an entry, I can then select, for example, this agent. And then I can just call it new identity. And what I do is because I've told Tonya that this runs Kubernetes, it's going to pre-populate with all the different selectors that I can kind of create it with, right? So if I can just say Kubernetes name, the namespace default, and then just fill in all the information here, and the pod name is my workload, for example, right? And then maybe for some reason I say I want to give this an admin, right? So the idea is that this form is going to help pre-populate everything and also use the metadata that has been configured to be able to educate what the values need to be. So this is a kind of very simple deployment, just single agent, nothing's in here. And so one thing I want to show is the Tonya dashboard. But of course, there's nothing here because we don't really have much in here. It's a fresh deployment. So I'm gonna go back to the slide to kind of talk a little bit, and then we'll take a look at a more complex deployment. So what we saw was we had the Spire deployment, and really what is the Tonya server is just a server that runs alongside the Spire deployment. And what it does for those that are familiar with Spire is it talks to the socket of the Spire server and exposes that through HTTP or HTTPS. So the next kind of example I want to show is something that's a little bit more involved. So what we have here is a tree cluster set up with a single Spire server. So single trust domain, we have a single Spire server here in the management cluster. We have an Amazon cluster, we have a Azure cluster, and we have an IBM cloud cluster as well, running on OpenShift. And so let's take a look at this. So single Spire server, multiple clusters. So this is the cool. So this is the server. So you can see just right off the bat. Oops, keep refreshing it. Right off the bat, we can see that on top of the plugins that we initially had, now we have these like AWS IID, node attester plugin, and the Azure MSI plugin that allows us to attest to different nodes and the different clouds. And so one thing right off the bat we can look at is something called cluster list, right? So this is something, this is the added metadata we talk about for accounting to be able to organize the nodes, right? Because if we just look at the different agents, right, there's no kind of segregation of, which agents are in a single cluster, how they group, how they different threat models, and so on. So if we go to cluster list, we can see that we have kind of the 4 clusters. We have the Azure cluster, 3 different Kubernetes clusters, and we have this one, which is the AWS one. And then what we can do, for example, we name this TSI test 03, but maybe let's name it AWS instead, right? So we can do cluster management. We can select the cluster, edit cluster. And we want to name this to the AWS cluster tree, right? Edit it. Okay, successfully edited. So now we have a cluster list as usual. We see it's now reading to AWS. And this is, I think, the cool part of it. So if we go to the Tonya dashboard over here, we can see from overview that, here are the number of agents per cluster, what's the distribution of agents in the entire Spire server per cluster that we've defined. And then we can kind of also look at the distribution of the different workload entries per agent. So again, this is kind of like architecturally multiple clusters, but we haven't populated it with that many workloads. So you can see like most of the clusters only have like 2 or 3 registered ones. So yeah, this is like an overview of like what the clusters, the agents, and you can also see the entries. If you look at the different entries, we can also tell from just from looking at the entries here that this belongs to the Kubernetes cluster. Does it have the administration flag and so on? And we can filter out based on the different fields.
Hey Brandon, back to my initial question. So you're counting the number of registration entries created, right? You're not counting the number of workloads that have been issued identities of this entry.
Correct. This is just the entries that are being created.
Okay, and same with the clusters. These are clusters that have been entered into the system, but you're not tracking whether those are connected or disconnected, right?
Correct. So those are just really user-defined organization constructs. The idea is just for people to be able to say, okay, here's like kind of like a grouping of things that I want to manage, and in the future to be able to have a better view on them, or be able to query information directly to, okay, I just want information about all the spy entities that are related to this particular agent based on that grouping. And
Very cool.
I think one of the things that we are also thinking is that now we just say clusters, but we will also be able to add labels to certain agents. So you could think about there being a query language where we could say, okay, get me all the entries for the workloads that are running on agents that have TPM attestation, for example.
Are you thinking the same for trust domains?
Yeah, so that's a good point actually. So what we've all been kind of looking at the screen here is just been a single trust domain, so single spire server. We don't have a time to show the manager UI for this presentation, but I have a slide on that. So the idea is that you could register the manager with multiple spire servers, and then you will be able to manage the different trust domains there. That is some future work that we have still yet to do to kind of make that interface a bit more user friendly across trust domains. Does that kind of give you an idea of what you're asking? Okay, so last cool thing on the board now is, for example, you can also click on one of these things, look at the information, and the idea here is that you can click on a cluster and see all the workload entries that are being created. One of the things that we want to do in the future is, we should be able to, for example, click on the details of a particular workload entry. And the idea is that on top of being able to see the information about the, oops, my server seems to be. Okay. So on top of being able to see the different information about the dashboard and which entries that it has, the hope is also to be able to also aggregate it with all the attestation information that Andrews was talking about just now. Cool. So coming back to kind of what Andrews was saying previously, where we were just looking at one trust domain. Now, what happens when I have multiple trust domains? How do I manage it? We don't have time to kind of show that aspect of it yet, and we kind of want to build up a little bit more of it as well. But the idea is that we have this component called the Tonya Manager, and what the architecture looks like is each Spire server will run with it a Tonya server. So there'll be a UI for every single Spire server. But at the same time, we have the manager that will talk to the Tonya server. And the idea here is that it's going to be able to aggregate all the information for the Spire servers in the manager. And what happens is then all the Spire servers also connect to a set of infrastructure services like policy, logging, the upstream CA, the key management, and stuff like that. And the idea here is that the manager would be given the authorization as well to pull all this logging information for all the infrastructure services and aggregate it in the manager, right? So then someone like the CISO or the security operator would be able to come in and just grab everything out. Cool. So I think I'll pass on to Mariusz.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. So let me just give you a little bit of background why we are focusing on Tonya. So, well, there is a bigger problem we are trying to solve. And let's explain this through the multi-cloud example. So let's say we have a request to access from one cloud various resources that are residing in another cloud. We could potentially use some static credentials like password, tokens, API keys, but doing this securely across the cloud providers is hard. So we need identity that federates across different cloud providers. So the next slide, please, thank you. To run the same architecture on different clouds, we could use OpenShift platform that is cloud provider agnostic, but this solves only one of the problems. Most leading clouds have already built in their own identity solutions. But to federate the workload identities between clouds is still facing some challenges. So mainly, the schemas of the identity and their interpretations are not consistent across the providers. They have different conventions and different trust implications. They require custom mapping and maintaining the trust relationship between pairwise clouds. Next slide, please. So the main project that Brandon and I are focusing on right now, it's called Universal Workload Identity. It is built on the open standard SPIFFE identity specification, and it's using our Tonya to simplify the Spire management. As a result, we get a zero trust workload identity framework with strong workload attestation. It defines and manages consistent workload identity schema across Kubernetes and OpenShift clusters, provides a cloud-specific attestation, and handles policies for all the Kubernetes workloads. So next slide. So to summarize, the universal workload identity runs on everything that supports OpenShift or Kubernetes, and it can manage various identity mechanisms like IAM, Keycloak, and through open standards like OpenID. We have several use cases that demonstrate how, for example, one can use OIDC to access Amazon S3 block storage from another cluster, or how we can retrieve secrets from Vault using OIDC. So the next slide. So our universal workload identity framework, it's an open source project available in this GitHub location. It contains a suite of Helm charts supporting various platform deployments like Amazon, Azure, IBM Cloud, OpenShift. The charts also include Spire, OIDC provider, and Kubernetes workload registrar with several examples. We are going to be demonstrating more of these aspects during the KubeCon session on October 14th in LA. So we plan to show the details on the deployments, techniques that we used for setting up the multi-cluster as well as the multi-cloud trust. We will show some OIDC and Vault examples. So please stop by if you are planning to be there, or if not, just track our activities online. Back to you, Brendan.
All right, next, Mariusz. Yeah, so as Mariusz mentioned, we have the lot of cool demos that we're planning to show at KubeCon. But so for now, now that Tonya is part of CNCF and SPIFFE, I think one of the things that we try to do is really expand this. We hope that this project is going to be useful to everyone. We've gotten some interest from folks that have are thinking about using it. To be able to help the governance, we hope to be able to get one more maintainer from another organization, since it's mainly IBM now. So if anyone would like to contribute to this, feel free to reach out to Mariusz, and I would be more than happy to engage folks on that. So upcoming features in the roadmap that we have is our registration RBAC policy integration. This was some work that we did do upstream to Spire to be able to define OPA policies on what kind of identities can be created, and in general for the entire Spire API. Spire API. Also log integration, what we talked about, being able to click on a particular workload entry and to be able to see, okay, when was this workload identity provision, and so on. And we have an open issue that is for feedback. So, if you find something that you would want to see in Tonya, or you don't like, if you don't like how the logo looks, for example, just put in a comment there. If not, yeah, I think that's all we have for today. And, we look forward to seeing folks at the KubeCon as well.
Awesome. Fantastic presentation, both of you. This is very exciting. There were a few comments in the chat. Logo's cute. Love the logo. UI UX is awesome. John pointed out time to leave should probably
yeah.
be time to live.
Yeah.
So I want to give folks a few minutes for questions before we jump on to the next presentation.
Hey, Brandon, what's the policy management you were talking about in Tonya in the beginning?
Yeah, so one of the things that we recently upstreamed to the Spire upstream, and I know Ash, I was consulting you about this. So it was so Spire, the Spire server has a bunch of APIs, right? Whether it's like I want to create a new workload entry, I want to register an agent, and so on. And there was an ask, I think this originally came from Uber, that we want to be able to manage this in a way to have finer grain authorization control. So we created a PR to enable installation of an OPA policy to be able to say which identities can create workloads, which identities can delete workload entries, and so on. So I'm gonna paste the PR in, and the hope, at least for initially, is to be able to manage some of these policies as well through the Tonya interface. But let me just put in the PR.
I threw the issue in there for background.
Okay, thank you.
And part of the problem is, well, the system is meant to be consumed programmatically for scale, and Spire implements a concept of an admin workload. So if the machine performing the registrations can't show a nested, an identity document that is of type admin, then it can create these entries. But this creates problems when, well, how do you give out this admin nesbits? Like, how do you reason around different responsibilities? Who has access to this API? So it starts role basing who this admins are, and like, well, can they write to all trust domains? Can they write to a single trust domain, which was the thing at the time? So yeah, super cool to see the pull request, Brandon. This is awesome.
Thanks, Andres, for shedding more light on that.
And how are we going to do security assessment of Tonya itself?
I will open an issue. Fine.
Thank you.
It's secure by default.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, this has been fabulous. All right, next up, policy management white paper draft presentation.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce our team. Jim Bugwadia, Jaya Ramanathan, Robert, and myself. We've been working in the policy management work group on a white paper. We just wanted to bring it here to you all so you can opine on it and provide any feedback. We actually did a presentation on this in CSA Summit last week, and we also have a panel discussion during Cloud Native KubeCon later this year. I can't say the whole thing. Over to Jim. Jim, you're sharing your screen. Thank you. So you want to lead the presentation, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I can just walk through the outlines. So thanks, Aradhana. Thanks, everyone, for having us. Yeah, so like Aradhana was mentioning, the idea here was to have a paper just kind of describing Kubernetes policy management. Because as much as we talk about policy management, one of the things we found in the working group is there's still, the adoption for policies still is not that great. And there's always questions about, okay, well, Kubernetes provides things like network policies. A lot of times when we talk about policies, folks immediately think about network policies in Kubernetes, but there's a lot more to it than that, right? So the idea here was to elaborate on that, and we heavily were influenced and leveraged, some of the work that this team has done in the Cloud Native Security White Paper, including some of the best practices for creating such white papers, because obviously it takes quite a lot of time, effort, and alignment. So thank you for that. And what we just wanted to do here, like Aradhana was mentioning, is we will, are just opening this up for wider comments. We've had a first round of review and comments, but would love to get more feedback, comments, see if this is, kind of hits at least what we've identified as the target audience and some of the key problems and things we're trying to articulate. One challenge that we had, which would love to get feedback on as well, is really scoping this or keeping the scope of this focused on Kubernetes, right? Because it's very tempting to talk about a lot of different things, and policies can be applied everywhere and anywhere, and perhaps should be, but here we're specifically want to focus on Kubernetes and Kubernetes policy management. So that's what we were constantly, and a lot of comments and feedback we initially got were trying to make it clear about what's covered, what's not covered, and keeping to that scope. So anyways, just walking through the outline and section. So I think the target audience that we decided on is primarily practitioners who are using Kubernetes, and for them to understand what Kubernetes policies are all about, where they would apply, how they would be used. And then, of course, all of the other stakeholders, whether it's the various DevSecOps team members or security teams, even we have some sort of discussion on how policies, Kubernetes policies, can map from the operational layer more to compliance layers and things like that, right? So the paper kind of starts with more of an architecture view of where Kubernetes policies would apply and would be enforced, where decisions would be made, and we use the XACML reference architecture to start with, but then adapted it slightly to Kubernetes and extended it in at least in one place in terms of what policy management involves. We then also adopted the same lifecycle phases as in the Cloud Native Security White Paper, talked about how Kubernetes policies would apply to that. And then in the final section, and we had a tough time with organizing this, but the idea was to show how Kubernetes policies map from that operational layer into other security domains and aspects, right? So I guess for lack of better term, we kind of call this security mappings, and in there covered security assurance and compliance. And again, these sections are very much from the Cloud Native Security White Paper. We leveraged things we felt which were applicable to Kubernetes policies. So we didn't want this to get, obviously the paper, we wanted to keep it in that 10 to 20 sort of pages at the most, and that we're right about that mark. So we wanted to keep this as concise and brief as possible, but really deliver value to the community and to this audience. So I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but certainly the idea here was to just introduce the paper, and we're, as you can see here, one of the things we were also trying to do, like I mentioned, was really leverage prior work, but then define what we want to focus on. So here, for example, we call out that we're Kubernetes. Obviously, all 4 layers are very applicable, but here we're more concerned with clusters and containers. And there's the line between code and container kind of gets a little bit fuzzy. So that was also difficult to call out. But we've sort of treated container more from the runtime perspective here, but we talk about how manifests for Kubernetes and especially also images need to be secured across the different deployment phases. Aradhana or anyone else, anything else to add to this, or any specific areas we want to discuss in more detail?
We did have a specific area for security operations and policy management for security as well. We had some discussions up front whether we should include that or not, because it's Kubernetes specific, but security is like a horizontal or a vertical across all the segments. So we did include that. I mean, obviously, we can put a lot of information here. We're trying to keep this scope down and see where we can add value. So any feedback you have on the security sections will be helpful as well. And any follow-up items that we can add to this paper as phase 2, any ideas you have from that perspective will be helpful as well. And how do we evolve this or mature this further?
Yeah, I'll just add that there's a lot of content that absolutely could be its own white paper, and we kept, even this morning as we were reviewing it, kept saying maybe that should be an appendix, that could be an appendix. So I think any one of these topics could be its own white paper. So I think we had to be judicious and editorial around cutting it down to size.
Right.
I think that's a challenge that you're going to get with any paper. And I remember us having that with the Cloud Native Security White Paper and the Supply Chain Security Paper. One of the things that I would actually like to see from this group in order to help facilitate public comment and review on it is kind of a better definition of like what that scope is and what you're expecting from a public comment. That way we can send out a call for action to our mailing list, put it on our Twitter account, and kind of drive more attention to this. So if there are specific focus areas where you want more attention, if there is clear direction on what is considered in scope or out of scope of the paper, to try to help narrow down some of that. And then if folks have any one-on-one questions, who would be the right kind of point of contact to just ask general questions, or where would they go?
Okay. Yeah, we can certainly help outline that just briefly, right? So Robert and myself would be the right points of contact for any questions, like if anything comes up for the paper, and if there needs to be any one-on-one, the policy working group Slack is also, of course, for more general questions, any topics. The scope is, there is some attempt to clarify that, but I think it's a good idea to reiterate that in an email, or if you're looking for additional reviewers. The sections where I think, again, we had the perhaps most discussion, or even some still pending open areas are like around beyond the architecture, mapping, like the security mapping section, and then even the lifecycle phases, right? So those would be good to focus in on, see what needs to be in this white paper, what could be, and if there's things that could be extracted out. But Emily, I'll follow up with, maybe on Slack with just these details as well. So that would be great to get more specific help on these.
Pushkar brought up a good point as well, that we can cross-post this with the Kate SIG security space and also get more attention that way. So we can also partner with them to make sure that they send it out to their mailing list, or we can possibly cross-post.
Right. Yes, Robert, I think there were plans to do that. Did you want to do that post, or do you prefer if someone from or I guess if it's cross-posted?
Yeah, our meeting is coming up on Thursday, I believe. So I thought that was the appropriate venue. But I'm happy to post, cross-post, repost. I'm not a big tweeter, so if someone else is tweeting, I'll let them do that.
So one comment I have, Jim, is that do we want to integrate with ToneJack in the paper, or show how ToneJack will integrate with the policy management?
All up for it. I'm down to discuss that and see how we can.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if it's applicable, and again, going back to the discussion on scope, if it makes sense, happy to figure out, what we can include. Yeah, one other thing is in the paper, we called out, like, we're not specifically talking about tools or even policy languages, anything like that. We just wanted to focus this on concepts, because it's again very tempting to kind of dive in and say, well, here's how this particular solution addresses this or solves these problems, but we tried to keep away from that.
Yeah, I'd imagine it'd get tricky not to start talking about things like PLA plus and SMT solvers. I asked you this before when you presented Governo, and I know the policy group 2 years back discussed about, well, what's the state of the art around formal verification methods? But does the paper include anything around like checking like a policy model against what's actually been enforced?
No, so
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
go ahead, Robert. Yeah.
I was gonna say we have an archived effort on the policy prototypes repo where we had linked that discussion from a couple of years ago. So it's on, and I think, Jim, we have it on our GitHub roadmap card. So it's definitely an area that I'm interested in. I know we even had a Slack conversation with a PhD student just recently. So if there's broader interest in doing that, I think definitely let's bring that up on the policy work group Slack channel. But no, in the context of this Kubernetes policy, it was really focusing on what exists today, specifically in open source. And then, since that doesn't really exist yet, but I'd love to refresh it in a year and have something to show around that area.
Yeah, it'd be awesome. In conversations with end users, I often hear the ask for an alternative to AWS's Selkova and their provable security services. And there's really no open source framework around it, but there's there's a big field of practitioners wanting to take some of that and translate it across heterogeneous systems.
Yeah, Zelkova was one that we looked at. Microsoft has a couple of tools. Agreed. I think it's an interesting topic.
Yeah, I've started dabbling in the space, currently reading the TLA Plus book and playing with composing specifications. So happy to geek out if there's interest to revitalize that.
I will poke you on the channel. Absolutely.
Right on. Thank you.
Yeah, and certainly one idea could be like we could, of course, include like a section for future research or activities or work like that, right? Because there are, of course, gaps in the space in the field where we're looking to have folks or the community focus. So that may be good. All right, so I think that's really what we wanted to do, is introduce this paper and get just socialize what we're trying to do there, and we'll follow up with more information. So either Robert or I will post on the Slack channel with more information, and would love to get quick reviews, feedback, and just thoughts on how this fits.
That sounds fantastic. So we have had 2 really awesome presentations today. We have about 7 minutes left. I want to open it back up to any questions about either presentation and any questions in general about security tag. Brandon, I know I cut you off earlier if you wanted to add on anything.
No, I don't think there was. We pretty much covered what we wanted to cover. So.
Okay, so to recap, Tonya is looking for a maintainer, also looking for lots of help. So folks that are interested, please go check out the repo, head up the points of contact in the meeting notes and get involved there. Also, please review the paper that was linked for the policy management for Kubernetes. I know that this group produces a lot of papers, generally speaking, but without those papers, we can't actually start moving down reference architectures, and we're not inspiring other folks to create tooling and solve those gaps within the ecosystem. So just wanted to bring that up. Please review. Does anybody have any pressing announcements before I let everyone go?
I have one, and I shared it on the chat, so just wanted to give some color to that. We had a feedback from the CNCF survey, which said that we want to know as an end user what secure defaults really mean and how can we try to go closer to that. And a couple of sessions back, I think one of us had a feedback in terms of writing something which is very brief, concise, and at a higher level that explains the ideology or opinions of our community about what secure default means. similar to how the style guide for Python is written, which is called PEP 8. So I wrote up something really similar to that for secure by defaults. I'll share the link again. What I'm looking for from everyone before we can share it outside of the group as well is, let me know if this is completely off track, or this doesn't make sense, or this is already too broad, or very deep in terms of the level we are trying to reach. I received some comments from Rob, and then happy to get more comments. Only thing is, this is on HackMD instead of GitHub PR. So you'd need to log into HackMD to add comments. If it helps to have it on GitHub, I'm happy to create a PR. Just need help from the co-chairs and tech leads to find the right place for it.
We can certainly help you out with that. In the interim, the HackMD file should be good. And then once that's gone through that round of revisions, we can help with the PR. So yet another call to action for review. Pushkar, I will send you a template to fill out, and we'll also send that out to the mailing list.
Okay, sounds good.
So I just wanted to share something. I just came from an hour of discussion with different financial services entities, MasterCard, Visa, Vex, and several others, on contactless digital payment platforms and security threats there, and how these are all microservices and they back into container platforms, and how to build security and what are the challenges there. I think there's a lot that we can do from a CNCF perspective, because I was asked that question. Are you doing any work in terms of contactless, digital payment platforms? And so I was going to take it up with the financial services working group and see if we can produce some guidance around this for the industry to use. I just wanted to share it here and see if anyone has any interest in working on this.
I worked for a long time in one of the companies you mentioned. So
Okay.
happy to join on that effort and give any feedback there.
Sure, yeah. And I'll create an issue and we can triage it from the formal
Sounds good.
perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise, Aradna, I can connect you to some resources. We built some of the Visa MasterCard protocols back in the early 2000s. So happy to connect you and or chime in.
Also industry standards, right? Industry standards are evolving in this space, regulatory compliance, etc. And also the whole supply chain security came up in the conversation. So I shared the work that we are doing as part of our supply chain security working group and the reference architecture. So they were quite curious about that work. I just wanted to share that as well. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have.
All right, I'm going to let everyone go with 2 more minutes back in your day. Thank you so much for joining us.